Good morning. My name is Dr. Melati, and I'm the lead researcher for the project. Today it will be my honor to basically brief you about the report. I will try to do justice to it. It's a very long report, as you can see. But I hope to be able to touch on the key findings from the report, and maybe we can spark some conversation for later. I'd like to thank a number of people, individuals, organizations before I begin. First of all, I would like to thank our hosts, the ASEAN-Korea Center. Joshua and his team have been excellent in managing everything. Thank you so much. I'd also like to thank His Excellencies for being here, for welcoming my team. I'd like to thank Kotra, the ASEAN Secretariat as well, Dr. Cole and her team at Korea University, as well as more than 70 individuals and organizations that we spoke with across the region in order to come up with this report. So thank you so much, and let's begin. So in this presentation, and I think, do I control the slides? Okay, I do. I will cover the following topics. So at first, we will basically go through an overview of ASEAN, what is happening in ASEAN in terms of ESG. We will then move on to policies and best practices across the region. I will then provide you a sort of look at sectoral investment guides. So for investors looking to invest in various aspects of ESG across the region, what sectors basically can be highlighted and which ones are currently being focused by different countries. And then finally, I will talk about the way forward and then things we can sort of expect to happen in this space. Now, let me first give you an overview of ASEAN. So ASEAN is, of course, as you know, comprised of 10 countries covered in this report. So we have Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Vietnam, Malaysia, Myanmar, Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand. It is an economy that contains 664 million people. It's a $3.35 trillion economy. And it's a very diverse region, as I think something that we're trying to highlight in this report in terms of capabilities to execute ESG policies, as well as in terms of what each country is focusing on. So ASEAN faces very large and interrelated challenges related to socioeconomic development and environmental sustainability. And there is a very strong need for credible and just ESG practices, as well as this idea of green growth, which is basically trying to raise living standards while also preserving and living alongside and conserving the environment. We also talk quite a bit about the ASEAN way in the report, specifically about consensus building, international engagement, and providing a pathway of which member states can move at their own pace because, again, due to this diversity. So we like to think about ASEAN as not only a formal organization, but also sort of a networked informal institution that helps provide support and kind of help across each of the country and member states. So we're here to talk about ESG, so I thought I'd just bring us back a little bit in terms of the history of ESG. So we know that ESG gained prominence in 2005 under the leadership of then UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. And we have the E, the environmental considerations. So this refers to a very large kind of set of topics, including climate change mitigation, biodiversity preservation, pollution prevention would all fall under E. And then we have social considerations. So we have issues of inequality, we have labor relations, human rights. We have G. We basically looks at management structures, employee-employer relations, remuneration. So that will form G. And as we're going to see later, each country perhaps has different focuses, but there are certain parts of ESG, I think, that ASEAN can and should move forward with when we're thinking about what's going to happen in the future. And we also have taxonomies that act as a guide for private sectors to achieve sustainable finance goals. And so we have the, of course, ASEAN taxonomy for sustainable finance. Now, when we're looking at sort of an ASEAN overview, so we chose some variables to sort of focus on here. So for example, we know that economic development and GHG emissions are linked. And so the idea here is that due to the diversity in countries, one challenge is going to be for emerging ASEAN member states to ensure a just energy transition. And we believe that quite a bit has been done in this space. So you can kind of, I think, read a bit more about each of these tables in the report. So I'm not going to be able to spend too much time on it. But the thing to note here is that, again, the diversity, I think, is both a strength, but something that ASEAN countries, I think, should be able to move at their own pace, and something that we look forward to seeing in the future. In terms of sustainable finance markets, so we have very different stages. Here we have plotted looking at sort of the amount or kind of the total portion of sustainable bonds. We see that Singapore is a leader in bonds and Philippines is a leader in disclosures. So we have some differentiation between countries and some countries which have not quite yet developed their sustainable finance markets. And finally, we have renewable energy. So emerging economies of ASEAN, we have, for example, Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar, have high renewable energy use and significant investable carbon offsets. So you can see here, what we're looking at here is investable carbon offsets. And again, the diversity is quite interesting, I think, as a researcher, but also something that could potentially be a strength for each of the countries to focus on what they're good at. Now, here we have looked at sort of a regulatory heat map. So darker values basically indicate that the country is sort of focusing more on that kind of piece of the ESG landscape. And on the x-axis here, we have all the different countries, and on the left, we have different categories. So whether or not a country has a very formal ESG policy framework, whether or not it looks at, it has a bunch of treaties in place in terms of governing what happens in this landscape. And you see here, again, different countries have different strengths. And so I think thinking about basically from an investment perspective, which country and sort of which aspects you invest in is going to depend, I think, also on how the countries are looking at various portions of the ESG framework. And when we're thinking about kind of reaching a consensus overall throughout ASEAN, we see that ASEAN basically balances national interests of its members with regional collaboration and policy coordination. And the ASEAN taxonomy has actually provided a common language and framework. And we know, for example, that this ASEAN Way, which has resulted out of various things, but also informal meetings between ASEAN government officials, this has basically thinking about, sort of moving away a bit from unilateral policy decisions towards a more regional collaboration as kind of a bloc. And when we're thinking about how ASEAN deals with the outside world, I guess, we're sort of looking at three, I think, main components. So we have supply chains and financial institutions. There's increased consumer demand for transparency in supply chains. There's increasing scrutiny of financial institutions and market regulators demanding sound ESG practices. So I think this will also definitely have an effect with how ASEAN member states think about trading and connecting with the world. We also have the influences, I think, of larger kind of blocks or countries moving, which affects, I think, smaller countries in particular. So the EU has and is a driver of global environmental standards. And so when we're thinking about, what happens in EU and the regulations passed there, they definitely do have an effect on ASEAN. The United States, so we know, for example, US custom rules and trade rules have been enforced quite a bit against a number of ASEAN labor abuses in various countries. So we are thinking that, industrial policy is set in the US as well, will basically have an effect on how ASEAN interacts with the world. And in terms of ASEAN as an ESG investment destination, so we know that ESG practices are spreading quite widely across ASEAN, but of course the rate of adoption varies quite a bit amongst countries and sectors. So in this report, we have tried to kind of give you a sense and compiled all the information that both we know and countries know about what is happening with regards to the landscape. And so some of these are sort of the main key takeaways in terms of investments. So we know that finance and export sectors are taking the lead. We know that ASEAN is quite cost sensitive when it comes to ESG initiatives. That it is still currently riding the ESG wave. There are high-tech opportunities in the region for investment. There is sort of a remaining human resource issue, which is that there is a large skills gap between basically what is needed and what countries can currently supply. There is sustainable infrastructure in place, some more developed in other countries than others. There are carbon offset opportunities. And there is also a little bit of regulatory uncertainty and also a bit of market instability as well. So that's just some things to highlight. So Prof. Ko and her team have contributed the Korea kind of contribution to the report, so I thank her very much for this. But in terms of the ASEAN and Korea relationship, we know that ASEAN is now the second largest trade partner and investment destination for Korea. We know that both share a common objective of playing bigger roles in global value chain and pursuing sustainable development. And we know that there are areas of mutual interest, including clean energy, future industries, environmental protection, education, and smart city development. And we know, for example, that ESG presents a new opportunity for expanded collaboration between the public and private sectors of ASEAN and Korea. So now I'm going to basically run through policies and best practices. And this is the pose we did just now. All right, so I'll just give you a little bit of overview on regional initiatives. So we know that ASEAN Secretariat basically functions as a regional policy coordinator. So regionally focused and sort of has a very open policy development framework. And you can see here and read a bit more about, these different policies across ASEAN. And so there are basically frameworks and kind of collaborations already in place at sort of the ASEAN level. And now what I'm going to do, and I kind of apologize for this because I'm going to be condensing a lot of initiatives into one slide. But for each of the countries now, we will basically go through the context for the country, the main policies related to ESG that exist in the country, and then we're going to go look at notable best practices. Now, this does not mean, of course, that there's only one best practice for each country. It's mainly that I had to confine myself to one slide. So let's start with Brunei. So Brunei, small country on the northern coast of Borneo with an abundance of oil and gas resources, and one of the highest standards of living, very high HDI index, for example, amongst ASEAN countries in terms of HDI, but also measured by GDP per capita. Brunei has a number of main policies surrounding ESG in place, and I think one notable best practice in Brunei, and I was actually in Brunei a couple weeks ago, which is that the government is confronting environmental challenges head-on by working with stakeholders to develop solutions. So Brunei, for example, has a significant population that lives on the water. And so I think the connection to the land and trying to understand basically how climate mitigation can happen is something that the country is quite focused on and has been working on quite well. So they do very well with the E portion of ESG. Cambodia. Cambodia's ESG landscape is still at a nascent stage, so still beginning. However, the government is already actively promoting green finance and sustainable initiatives. We have ESG regulatory framework does need to be strengthened to encourage ESG adoption, but that minds and hearts, I think, are currently already open to these initiatives, which makes things quite easy. It does have, for example, a national policy on green growth and carbon neutrality. Oh, thank you. And government has, for example, implemented capacity building initiatives to increase ESG awareness. So we have a sustainable agriculture summit, climate change summit, and we know that the government is exploring opportunities to issue green bonds as there are quite high demands from investors. So definitely an interesting, exciting place, especially thinking about sustainable agriculture for Cambodia, and something that I think we all can learn from quite a bit. Indonesia. So Indonesia relies quite heavily on natural resources to sustain economic growth. But it has also shown commitments, I think, towards achieving a low carbon and climate resilient economy. It has a number of main policies that are currently being implemented, and I would like to kind of highlight two of them, so the Indonesia Green Taxonomy and also the Just Energy Transition Partnership, I think, are kind of the main policies coming out of Indonesia. Notable best practices, so we know that most state-owned banks have either stopped or committed to stopping financing new coal-fired power plants, which is a very important step in thinking about energy transitions. And we also know that Indonesia has invested quite a bit of its resources to thinking about building the EV infrastructure. So that is also happening as well, which both helps kind of transitioning away from fossil fuels and also helps create jobs. So it's sort of a win-win situation for all sides involved. And then we have Laos. So Lao PDR is one of the least developed. However, we know that there is quite a lot of things surrounding, for example, sustainable agriculture that is happening, and also diversifying energy sources, also with an emphasis on renewable energy sources. There is in place a national green growth strategy and a biodiversity plan. And there are a number of notable best practices, but I would like to highlight two of them. Which is that given the relationship with trade relationships, we know that international financing requirements and changing market expectations are actually driving ESG adoption amongst companies in Laos. And also, which is kind of a highlight, the government is taking necessary steps to promote EV usage in the country as well. So this is quite fascinating to us and areas that we hope to see come up more from this country. Malaysia. Malaysia is a developing country with a growing ESG landscape where authorities are quite supportive of adopting ESG principles. We have that public listed companies are increasingly aware of the importance of ESG. However, awareness is actually quite limited for the smaller companies or the SMEs. We do have a number of main policies in place for this country. We have the climate change and principle-based taxonomy, and we have the sustainable and responsible investment roadmap. For notable best practices, so we know that the CCPT, so the Climate Change and Principle-Based Taxonomy's qualitative approach for describing climate-related activities is a successful approach. So when we're thinking about measuring impact and stuff like that, CCPT, in its sort of qualitative kind of understanding, gives us a very good picture of what to expect and what to happen, and perhaps is something that other countries can use as well. And the government does have a number of initiatives to ensure that SMEs are able to transition to low-carbon economy. Next, Myanmar. So with Myanmar, I think the ongoing political situation makes advancing ESG initiatives slightly more difficult, just because priorities for the government are quite different. That being said, I do think that there are main policies in place. So for example, Sustainable Development Plan that goes until 2030, and they also have a climate change strategy that goes into 2030 as well. And so here we see that ESG adoption is kind of what we call primarily driven by needs. So for example, the lack of energy supply and infrastructure is actually driving companies to adopt renewable energy such as solar. So there are basically a number of things coming out from the ESG landscape that are driven primarily by need, which is an interesting facet, I think, of this member state. With Philippines, we know that the geographical location makes it very vulnerable to climate risks, such as the tropical cyclones, flooding, and landslides. And the government has also announced an ambitious target of achieving an emissions reduction and promoting climate resilience. So a lot of it is sort of climate-based, and policies in place are National Climate Change Action Plan, so thinking about what to happen and sort of to mitigate against that. And we also have the Renewable Energy Act of 2008. Notable best practices. So we know CSR requirements in terms of listed companies has driven ESG adoption. So this is an example for where basically requirements set can actually help drive some initiatives and adoptions on the ground. And we do have that the government is taking steps to improve the current reporting standards to ensure that they are aligned with international best practices, for example, the GRI collaboration. Singapore, so context, forward-thinking sustainability policies and regulation, the higher standard of living among ASEAN countries in terms of GDP per capita, but also one thing that is not here is I think the landscape that is most rich with data, actually. So data availability and something that kind of feeds back into the ecosystem and allows it to be more flourishing. The main policies of ESG are the Singapore Green Plan and also a carbon tax in place. And notable best practices here is that we have the financial sector actually calling for more regulations and guidelines from central banks to enhance their ESG practices. So this is financial sector driven. And also Singapore did launch ESG Gnome, which is a disclosure portal for companies to report ESG data in a structured and efficient manner. So the availability and transparency of data actually has allowed Singapore to do quite a bit within its ESG regulatory framework. So something that, just to note here, is the best practice. We have Thailand as well. So Thailand, I think, has made significant progress, both in terms of ESG and improving SDG. The government and regulatory bodies are actually actively driving ESG awareness in the country. And we have main policies being, the Thailand taxonomy and the biocircular green, the BCG economic model. Noticeable best practices. So we see here that 37 Thai companies were actually included in S&P's Global Sustainability Yearbook 2023, and 12 companies were awarded gold class. And we see that given the younger generations, I think, interest in ESG, this is a very interesting best practice, but there's also one that can be replicated across the region, which is that regulatory body in Thailand has been working with social media influencers on Facebook and TikTok to increase financial literacy amongst young investors, a campaign which has been actually quite successful. Vietnam. Vietnam, I think, is a very attractive investment destination. The country has stable, growing macroeconomic environments, controlled inflation, and a rising middle class with increasing amounts of purchasing power. We do have that there is sort of policies in place as well. So we have one strategic framework for sustainable development cooperation, National Climate Change Strategy 2050. And we do have here notable best practices. So the startup ecosystem in Vietnam, as you can imagine, is quite vibrant. And startups are actually playing quite a vital role in the fight against climate change by developing climate solutions themselves. So thinking about how to basically deal with climate resilience from the perspective of the private sector, in fact, startups. And investors are eager to invest in renewable energy, but I think there needs to be a bit more push in terms of favorable policies in place to make it happen. Now for Korea. So numerous ESG initiatives have been launched to maintain the competitiveness of the Korean corporate sector. Korean firms are markedly, I think, increasing their engagement with ESG activities, spanning not only the domestic arena, but also encompassing their value chains and operations overseas. The main policies in Korea, we have the K taxonomy, so the Korean green classification system, and we also have a very advanced ESG infrastructure plan in place. Notable best practices. So the KETS was launched in 2015, making it the first nationwide cap and trade program operating in Asia. And 31 large Korean companies have made commitments to renewable energy 100%, and 17 financial companies have joined the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, indicating their commitment to sustainability. So I think there is a lot that we can learn from the Korean ecosystem. So if you want to know more about what Korea is doing, I invite you to read the report. And now we're going to look at sectoral investment guides. So this is basically a covering or thinking about different potential sectors, basically, for investment. So we have sustainable and social finance being the first one. So for each of these industries or sectors, basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you context about the sector, and then I'm going to tell you the main opportunities, and then go through some of the barriers. So let's look through sustainable and social finance first. So in this context, we have the ASEAN commercial banking market size is valued at $3 billion approximately in 2021, with projections of actually reaching $16.34 billion in 2031. We know that 6 out of 10 ASEAN countries have significantly underbanked or unbanked populations, which potentially can be an issue, but maybe also a strength in some situations. The main opportunities, so we know sustainable finance regional initiatives such as ASEAN Taxonomy for Sustainable Finance already exist, and we know that Islamic finance is gaining traction amongst Muslim countries in ASEAN, particularly in countries like Malaysia and Indonesia. Now, there is some barriers here, so there's an opportunity cost or sort of a trade-off between ESG and profit, meaning thinking about stakeholder interest protection. So that is something that we'll have to sort of look at a bit more. And there's also kind of poor awareness and lack of talent, specifically in this sector, can sometimes hinder progress. The next part we're going to look at is ESG service providers. So the context here is that growing ESG regulations imposed from abroad or from regions, from the region, has created demand for ESG services. And these are things including ESG consulting, ESG rating, and ESG software. So the main opportunities in this sphere is increasing need for sustainability reports from investors and increasing demand from international clients for companies in their supply chain to implement ESG practices. Now, the main barrier here is a limited talent pool, meaning, again, sort of human resource issues of kind of capacity building for talent to actually manage and contribute towards the sector, and quite a significant lack of data, especially from SMEs. This sector, so construction and real estate, we're going to sort of use it interchangeably with thinking about green building. So green building sector in ASEAN is gaining momentum, with investment opportunities expected to reach 3.4 trillion by 2025. The main countries driving the green building market in ASEAN are Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam. Sorry, talking for a long time makes my throat tickle a little bit. Okay. So the main opportunities here. So we have the Green Mark Incentive Scheme, so GMIS, were introduced to boost the adoption rate of green building technologies and sustainable building design practices in Singapore. And very interestingly, actually very impressively, Jakarta itself in Indonesia is estimated to have a 16 billion market for green buildings by 2030. So main barriers here that we have found from our interviews and from our data collection is that cost remains the biggest concern for developers to invest in green buildings, and also that there's a lack of public awareness and understanding on the benefits of owning a green building itself, which sort of hampers a little bit of the progress. Next, and I think one of the more exciting sectors, so infrastructure and transportation. So there is basically significant infrastructure investment in ASEAN, but largely concentrated in road, port, and airport constructions. And for now, rail and EVs are the most visible sustainable transportation. So the main opportunities here is that there are actually across the region very large infrastructure investments planned with green finance facilities from ADB and other lenders and donors. And we also have water supply and treatment infrastructure being a major need of investment, especially in the least developed ASEAN member states. The main barriers here, so we have regulatory uncertainty, bankability of sustainable infrastructure projects, and we also have vested interests that can also oppose the development of sustainable infrastructure and may lead to short-term economic disruptions. So this is thinking about as countries sort of transition to ESG, how that may kind of create short-term probably disruptions within the market in order for new kind of ways of thinking about business to kind of come up. So manufacturing. ASEAN is a major manufacturing hub due to the large working population, young workforce, and a strategic location. And the main industries in manufacturing are electronics, textile, and the automotive industry. The main opportunities are as follows. So manufacturers often have to comply with ISO standards, which makes it easier for them to adopt ESG practices. So ISO standards are basically standards that govern how factories, manufacturing industries are set up. And there is actually significant pressure from clients and consumers to adopt green manufacturing practices. Now, the main barriers are actually costs, again, so high cost of technology and machinery to implement ESG practices, and thinking about difficulties of educating employees regarding the importance of implementing ESG practices. We also have agriculture and forestry, so this is a very important sector for specific countries in ASEAN. So ASEAN is a large agricultural exporter, so we have palm oil, two of the largest exporters are in ASEAN, we have rubber, we have rice, we have sugar, etc. And ASEAN actually has 15% of the world's forests, but continued threat from deforestation. So some main opportunities here is thinking about using technology to improve yield, so improve farming practices, and also to basically educate the local market, and at the same time reducing environmental impact. So I think quite a bit of work has been done with this in sort of looking at research in the palm oil sector in Malaysia and Indonesia. So there are definitely opportunities there in terms of thinking about using tech to improve outcomes. There's also sale of carbon offsets, credits being a large potential driver for forest conservation. So the main barriers here, we have many small farmers with very weak socioeconomic positions, making adoption of new practices more difficult. And we have limited local capacity, expertise, and regulatory standards for sustainable agriculture, forestry, and carbon credits. EVs. So EVs are seen as a new pathway for the development of the automotive sector in ASEAN member states. And since basically EVs are produced as sort of part of a very broad global value chain, the main role of ASEAN member state basically lies in the production aspect of it, as well as manufacturing vehicles, but also batteries. So the main opportunity, there are definitely EV potential from countries that have existing auto industries, such as Malaysia and Thailand, and natural resources, such as Indonesia and Philippines. And several ASEAN member states consider the production of sale of EVs as a crucial policy driver to promote domestic EV production and investments in battery production. So there's definitely a lot of opportunities, I think, for investment surrounding this sector in the region. Main barriers, so EV affordability concerns. So this will, I think, always be an issue. We can see quite a bit of case studies coming out of Europe, who sort of started with the EVs first, to think about increasing or sort of enhancing the ability of households to afford EVs. That problem is actually a bit more severe in ASEAN due to sort of the salary gap and ability to buy. And there's also a lack of charging infrastructure. So meaning, given that the charging infrastructure and the vehicle itself are sort of complements, you have to have them hand in hand. There is kind of a lack or limit to that, although Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam have announced quite ambitious targets in this area. So we will see basically whether or not these targets are met, but also how having a better infrastructure actually contributes to EV adoption itself. And in terms of energy, so there is a growing energy demand to support economic development. There's been an increase in renewables, but unfortunately also coal power plants. And there are differentiated, meaning quite a diverse set of renewable opportunities. So for example, wind in Vietnam, hydropower in Laos, biofuels in Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Philippines. We have the opportunities being rising demand for renewable energy, and we have the expansion of the ASEAN grid, but also market liberalization. However, the barriers become inadequate energy market regulations and concern over cost of energy, including stranded assets due to this industry. So there definitely are some barriers here, but energy, I think, is also another exciting sector to think about when we're thinking about ASEAN. Waste management. So ASEAN generates a lot of waste, which presents a huge, actually, business opportunity in the waste management and recycling sector. And there are, of course, different types of waste. So I listed some here. So there's industrial waste, there's electronic waste, there's plastic waste. And so how do we actually deal with all of this waste, and sort of how can the ESG sector kind of step up? So the opportunities here is that governments have implemented policies and regulations to promote waste management and recycling practices. And there has been increasing urbanization and industrialization. However, there is a bit of lack of awareness from the public and insufficient funding basically for waste management projects. So for a lot of countries, this is not really seen as a priority sector, but due to the fact that we do all as humans, I think, generate quite a bit of waste, and soon we'll have battery waste as well from EVs, we have to think basically about how to deal with all of that. And there will be opportunities in this region to do so. Now, thinking about the way forward, so thinking about accelerating ESG adoption in ASEAN. To further encourage the adoption of ESG practices at the regional level within ASEAN, we should consider the following. So these are kind of some recommendations. I should note that these recommendations come from basically the set of 80 or so interviews that we've done, and also from our kind of in-depth reading of all policies from all the ASEAN member states. So what have people suggested, and what have we also read about the literature in terms of what can accelerate ESG adoption? We have basically thinking about promotion of creation of the ASEAN-wide ESG standards. We have thinking about considering developing simple national ESG standard for SMEs in particular, who seem to feel like they're being left out. Developing scenarios, roadmaps, and ESG action plans to inform and mobilize stakeholders. So policies only are impactful or relevant if actually it gets communicated to the populations that they're trying to reach. So I think this is something that the entire region can actually do better in terms of informing and mobilizing stakeholders to act, and to inform populations that are being targeted that in fact there are opportunities out there for them. ESG should also be promoted in public procurement of contracts, so that's something that we are recommending as well. And we should also focus on ESG-related local capacity building, both at university and for working professionals. So as you note from my presentation, a kind of common thread that's been recurring is thinking about this talent gap. So capacity building of human resources is going to be quite a significant thing that ASEAN will need to look at in order to move forward. And we're thinking about ASEAN-Korea partnerships. So we do have the Korea-ASEAN Solidarity Initiative, which basically has been implementing key strategic activities proposed in the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific. And it has been enhancing cooperation with ASEAN in various areas related to climate change and future industries, such as the ASEAN-Korea Methane Action Partnership and the ASEAN-Korea Methane Reduction Cooperation Project. And there are a number of basically new proposals coming up. So we have the ASEAN-Korea Infectious Disease Response Capacity Building Project. We have the expansion of the ASEAN Scholars Program. We have the Women Empowerment and Technical and Vocational Education and Training, TVET program. And also, we basically have Korea sharing its expertise and its experience with large SME win-win growth strategy and the Korea emission trading system. And so I think that is it from me. So let's keep in touch. So we would love to hear more from you. If you're from different countries or different sectors, we would like to hear basically from you about whether our assessment of what we said was correct. Also, we'd love to hear more about what is happening with things that are already put into place, and how can we sort of help, if in any capacity possible, in order to sort of help accelerate ESG adoption. I have here that I come from Asia School of Business, but we also, the ASEAN Research Center from Asia School of Business is also here. So please think of us when you're thinking about projects or collaborations with academia, and thank you very much.